So when we think about who's paying the cost of these tariffs, it's very clear that the vast majority of the cost is being paid by American consumers.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. Today, we're diving into the often overlooked S in ESG, or the social pillar of ESG. So we're looking at how industrial policy, for example, particularly tariffs, can end up raising prices, worsening cost of living pressures, and hitting low-income households hardest. To unpack this, I'm joined by Luke Heeney, a US-based economist and research associate in economics at Stanford University. He is also the recent recipient of the prestigious BHP John Monash Scholarship. Luke, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Michelle. Great to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
No worries. So we want to talk about a couple of the papers that you've published. But before that, let's start with just looking at the kind of research that you're doing. So what's your specialty?
Sure. So I work in a field of economics, which is called industrial organization. And what we do here, or my specific field of research, is trying to better understand how governments can design good industrial policy. This is an area that economics hasn't really had much to say about for many years, which is a problem given that industrial policies are some of the most important policies governments are looking at the moment. So I'm trying to build out the economic toolkit that allows governments to think through the consequences of their policies and to design ones that will help benefit Australia.
That sounds like a real knowledge gap, if you like. Even if we talk about the economy, we very rarely talk about policy. But now that with all this conversation around tariffs, suddenly this is like a real world issue. So now let's talk about your paper. You've just had a working paper released through the National Bureau of Economic Research, or NBER, which is a major platform for influencing policy debates globally. But before we get into the findings, why is it significant for a paper to appear as an NBER working paper?
The NBER is just an association of a lot of the top economists in the profession. So when you get to release your paper as an NBER working paper, it's a really good platform to get it in front of some great economists and to help spread the ideas in this paper, and also to get some feedback from some really good practitioners of economics.
I think I wrote a piece about the NBER only like a couple of months ago when we started talking about inflation and the kind of discussions around interest rates. But now back to industrial policy. Let's talk about your paper. At a high level, well, tell us what it is and what are your key findings.
So I wanted to analyze the recent 2025 US tariffs, which you and your listeners have probably seen in the news quite a lot. I looked at the impact of tariffs, particularly on the automotive sector, partly because it's a big part of what people spend their money on in the US, and also because it's got a lot of nice data for us to be able to disentangle all these effects. So what I wanted to do was say, when we think about tariffs, often we just think about the price of the foreign goods, or in this case, the foreign cars changing when you have a tariff. But what is not really studied very often is how all the inputs to those cars, that are even the cars that are assembled in the United States, how does having tariffs on all of those then flow through to affect consumers of even American cars and producers of American cars? And the reason that we want to be able to analyze all of these channels properly is because we want to understand which consumers and which firms are going to be hit hardest by these tariffs, and figure out whether the incidence or the cost of these tariffs is falling on US consumers or firms, or where it's falling. The key findings of my paper are that it's, first of all, it's very, very important to account for these intermediate parts when we're looking at the cost of tariffs. If we look at the producer side, if you don't account for the cost of tariffs on the intermediate parts, then it's very easy to mistakenly think that the tariffs overall are good for the domestic firms. They end up coming out ahead when you just look at tariffs on final foreign products. But when you look at the foreign parts being included in those tariffs, as they are in the current 2025 Trump tariffs, then most of the US producers end up losing a lot of money, billions of dollars in aggregate. And only a couple, surprisingly enough, Elon Musk and Tesla is the only firm that comes out ahead once you put the tariffs on the parts. And that's because Tesla has a lot of domestic parts used in their products. And then when we look at the consumers, we see that the hardest hit in terms of the percentage financial loss is to consumers in the lowest 20% of the income bracket. The total aggregate penalty ends up being a little bit higher on the high income earners, but this is just because many more high income earners were able to afford cars in the first place. So when we look at the percentage loss, or how we would usually think about a tax being regressive, the percentage losses are much higher for the lower income earners.
That feels to me that this is counterintuitive to, in fact, have protectionist policies, if you like. And certainly this is relevant here in Australia, where there's growing interest in an industrial policy beyond just energy. So, what warning does your paper offer policymakers who are eager to use, let's say, tariffs or local content rules more aggressively?
Yeah, so in Australia, we haven't had so much of a tariff discussion, but there is a lot of a discussion about industrial policies or protectionist policies in general. And any policy that, in effect, raises the cost of getting goods from overseas are going to operate through very similar channels to those which I study in my research. So it's very relevant for Australia. And the lesson is that it's extremely important to carefully study and design these policies without having a loose, broad brushed approach. Because if you don't carefully account for many of the various channels through which these policies can have effects on consumers or on domestic industry, then the outcomes of the tariffs can be counterproductive to the goal of benefiting Australian consumers or benefiting Australian firms.
And I do want to lean into the social dimension of your findings. As you've said, this hurts the cohort of consumers that are already financially struggling. So can I ask then, if your paper finds that low income households are hit the hardest, if I've got that correctly, why is it that that is not being factored right now in the policy debate? Is this what's different today than, let's say, a couple of decades ago or a decade ago when we think about industrial policies?
I think the reason why the effect on low income households is overlooked is partly because the effects of tariffs are not fully understood. So, research like what I'm doing and also some other economists in the US are doing is trying to shed light on these channels. And second is because I think policymaking, especially in the United States, is around industrial policy is tied up with an idea that manufacturing jobs or that protecting American industry is inherently good for all consumers. And while there are plenty of good reasons why you might want to bring some more manufacturing back to your country, it's not always the case that this is across the board good for all consumers or for all workers. And as the research has shown, this can actually be bad for both American firms and their workers and for American consumers if the policy is not designed right. And so when we're looking at these sorts of policies in Australia, it's really important that we invest the time and the resources and the academic thinking into figuring out how we can design these policies so that we don't have adverse consequences for those at the lower end of the income spectrum.
You're saying that the industrial policy isn't inherently good or bad, but it's highly design dependent. But firstly, how large are those consumer impacts compared to the impacts on businesses or companies?
Yeah, so on your point that is highly design dependent, I think that's very important, and that's one of the key things I'd like your listeners to take out of this. And then when we look at the magnitude of losses to consumers or losses to firms, in the case where all the parts and all the foreign vehicles are tariffed, American firms end up losing about $2.5 billion, and the equivalent welfare cost for consumers is nearly $40 billion. So that's somewhere close to 20 times of the impact falling on consumers than is falling on American firms. So when we think about who's paying the cost of these tariffs, it's very clear that the vast majority of the cost is being paid by American consumers.
Look, I'm trying not to fall off my chair at the moment with those kind of numbers. I mean, that's quite excessive, especially because consumers don't really think about the cost of all these kind of high level discussions around tariffs or government rules, right? But now you're saying they are losing like 20 times more, or they're disadvantaged by that magnitude. Were you surprised by this level of magnitude, or you had a feeling that there was a big cost to this?
I was somewhat surprised by the magnitude, although it's not a complete shock. The economics profession has used similar models to try and disentangle the effects of tariffs in the past, and it has typically always come back in the findings that consumers end up paying the majority of the cost. Your point that people still don't seem to factor this in when we're having these discussions about tariffs and protectionist policy is true and disappointing. And I think it's good that we can have these sorts of discussions today to show what the best economics says about who is paying the cost of these tariffs.
So we've talked about the problem, we've talked about the consequence. Now let's talk about solutions. I think you have recommended a toolkit or enhancements in your paper on how to kind of guide the decisions around industrial policy. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier in the podcast that economics hasn't really, as a field, provided policymakers with great tools to analyze and design industrial policies. My paper is a small step in the right direction to helping policymakers with that, but there's still a lot more to do. So, the reason why it's been very difficult for economics to provide these tools to policymakers so far is that there's a lack of data to think about really big, grand moments of industrial policy throughout recent world history, which means that you have to
Mm.
get much more clever with the mathematics and the methods to be able to have a toolkit that lets you simulate the effects of these industrial policies on things like where do firms base their manufacturing, how are supply chains rearranged, where does the incidence fall, and who is paying the cost of these. So my future research is going to keep building out this toolkit and trying to create more complex and more sophisticated tools to model out the impact of Australian, specifically industrial policies, on which manufacturing bases we might be able to build up in Australia and how that would help the country.
That's really exciting to hear, Luke. And congratulations again on the two major working papers that you already have out. So, what's next for you?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm applying to start my PhD next year in 2027, supported by the John Monash Foundation, who I'm very
Hmm.
grateful for supporting my work. I think that the John Monash community is a fantastic community of Australians, young Australians who are looking to build the future of the country, and I hope that my research can play a part in fulfilling that mission.
So, with all of that, Luke, let's say you get to have tea with the prime minister today. What would you tell him?
Well, I would love to have tea with Mr. Albanese. I think that would be great fun. I would say that it's really important for Australia to take these questions of industrial policy and more generally how to build for a prosperous 21st century, or what's left of the 21st century for Australia. I think that in a world as tumultuous as we have at the moment, it's really important to think very hard about what Australia needs to do to make herself strong for the decades ahead. And once we've aligned on what sorts of things the country needs, then the question turns to how do we design the right industrial policies to do that efficiently and effectively, and so that we actually achieve the outcomes. So the number one thing that I would do is encourage Mr. Albanese to think hard about the vision that he has for Australia. What's our place in the world going to be? What do we need to achieve that? And then tell him to give me a call so we can figure out how to actually design the policies to deliver that.
Well said. Well, I'll make sure I'll get my people to talk to his people, to talk to your people, and get that appointment set this year. Jokes aside, Luke, once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. It's been great to chat with you.
If you'd like to read Luke's work in full, we'll include links to his NBER papers and research in the show notes. Once again, this is The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.